Welcome to the Venezuela Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, José Granados, Ceja. The Venezuela Analysis Podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on this week's program, I'm joined once again by fellow staff writer Andreína Chávez from the team over at Venezuela Analysis. And once again, we're going to be giving you a review of everything that's happened since, with so many developments happening so quickly when it comes to Venezuela, and particularly with this new aggression by the United States. I think some of the pieces are really starting to come together. In some of our previous episodes, we had talked about, will there not be an invasion? Will they continue to go down this path? I think it's very clear that the United States has made its determination and is now clearly, definitively pursuing regime change once again in a very direct, aggressive, violent manner against the Bolivarian Revolution and, of course, its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who is having to endure a very complicated situation, a very difficult international situation with a very bellicose and unpredictable United States now pursuing regime change, as I said. And so there's one major story that obviously we're going to start with, but before I get to that, I want to give an opportunity for Andreína to say hello to our audience. Andreína, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and hello to everyone. And I hope everybody here is ready to talk and listen to some really difficult analysis that we're going to have to make. And as everybody in the world, the last thing that I want is for something as terrible as a military intervention to happen to Venezuela. But I think it's important that we discuss it seriously because I think the threats that are being made are quite serious. I think that the U.S. government is definitely setting all the steps, like preparing the scenario for such a situation. So I think it's important that as anti-imperialist media outlets, we talk about it, we denounce it all the time.
Absolutely. And so let's start with the big piece of news that's happened since the last time we did a program around Venezuela here on the podcast, which is the decision to award the Nobel Peace Prize to Maria Corina Machado. And I want to share this analysis piece here that we had from our friend Michelle Elner about how she argues, essentially saying that with her winning the Nobel Peace Prize, peace has lost all its meaning. And of course, here in the teaser, far from a symbol of peace, the article exposes Machado's history of supporting coups, sanctions, and calls for foreign military intervention in Venezuela. So I think that's a good place to start, Andreína. Let's talk about who Maria Corina Machado actually is. Not this image, not this narrative that they're putting out there since she was awarded this prize by the Nobel Committee, but really who she represents in actuality and why it is so worrisome that they've decided to once again try to elevate her profile in these really dangerous times.
So I want to begin by saying that we need to also look at Norway and look at the Nobel Committee and look at who they are, because it's important to know that. The Nobel Committee is made up of 5 people. And out of these 5 people, I've discovered that at least 4 of them are sympathizers of the far right. And they are conservatives, they are right-wing, and only one of them is considered like a very light social democrat. And these are the 5 people that we are supposed to believe that have the best position to decide who has done more for peace and democracy in the world. So, of course, we need to place this Nobel Peace Prize as something that is politically motivated. There are political motives behind it. They granted this award to Maria Corina Machado precisely because she represents the Western interest in the global South. She represents the European white supremacy. She represents everything that the right conservative wing in these European Western countries are promoted. She is being awarded precisely because they are trying to give her some kind of credibility. They're trying to promote this idea that she is the ideal person to govern Venezuela in the event that the Nicolás Maduro is actually overthrown, either by a military intervention or by a CIA covert mission that we now discover is also underway. So they're trying to create this idea that Maria Corina has the credibility to reach power in Venezuela. We also have to understand that the Nobel Peace Prize is an instrument of soft power. not only because of the idea that it promotes the idea that this person is somehow promoting peace and democracy, despite the fact that she has done the complete opposite, but also because it is a prize that comes with a monetary price too. It is almost $1 million. So if you look at it that way, they're basically funding Maria Corina Machado's destabilization campaign in Venezuela. They are funding their terrorism in Venezuela, her violence. They are funding the plot to overthrow the Maduro government. So we need to, I think one of the mistakes that we have made as anti-imperialist people, anti-imperialist outlets, and as global South people is that we continue to give credibility to these instruments of soft power like the Nobel Peace Prize. Just because in the past they have sometimes awarded this prize to people who actually deserve it, like Rigoberta Menchú. But those were exceptions. They were not the norm. Actually, if you look at the most recent people who won the Nobel Peace Prize, you will find that a lot of them are people who are aligned with Western ridiculous ideas of liberal democracy. These are people who are actually opposition to governments that the United States considers enemies. So you can see that this is a political instrument. And we, as people, as global South people, as anti-imperialists, we need to start giving it importance and credibility because it doesn't have any. This is all political motivation. And now, about Maria Corina Machado specifically, I think it's important to sort of break down exactly what she represents in Venezuela. And I actually wrote down some of this because I think it's so important to uncover that mask. So when they announced that Maria Corina Machado was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, the person who announced it, he said, and I quote, "She has brought her country's opposition together. She has never wavered in resisting the militarization of Venezuelan society. She has been steadfast in her support for a peaceful transition to democracy." So let's break down the statements and let's compare them with what Maria Corina Machado has actually done. Has she brought the Venezuelan opposition together? Absolutely no. If anything, she has divided the opposition. Venezuela has different opposition sectors, and most of them are moderate, and most of them believe in elections. Most of them have presented themselves in elections. They have won different public offices like governors, like mayors, and national deputies. And they reject these moderate sections of the Venezuelan opposition. They actually reject Maria Corina Machado. They reject her because she represents this old politics that believes in achieving power by force, that believes in achieving power by calling for military intervention, calling for U.S. sanctions, calling for violence in Venezuela. So the majority of the Venezuelan opposition actually rejects Maria Corina Machado, and they are completely against this idea, this promotion that she has lately, that the United States government should invade Venezuela. And so no, the answer there is that she has actually united the opposition, not at all. Now, the other part of the statement is she has never wavered in resisting the militarization of Venezuelan society. So the real thing that we should be asking ourselves is, she has actually never resisted the militarization of the Caribbean. She has not resisted once the U.S. militarization of the Caribbean. She has not once rejected the fact that the U.S. military has been bombing small boats in the Caribbean, killing people in what everybody believes are extrajudicial killings. She has not said a word about that. In fact, she supports these killings in the Caribbean. She supports this militarization of the Caribbean. She has actually been calling for this militarization to expand to other regions and to eventually strike inside Venezuela. So she's completely in favor of militarization as long as it is a foreign militarization and as long as it serves the purpose of her being able to reach power by a violent coup, a violent attack against Venezuela. But to answer the question specifically, I will also say that no, the Venezuelan society is not militarized. On the contrary, what we have, it is a civic military union that has proven to be very good and very effective to protect democracy. We saw it in 2002 when Hugo Chavez was briefly ousted of power, it was the people united with the military what brought Chavez back and what restored democracy in Venezuela. So no.
It's worth remembering that Maria Corina Machado was among those who signed that decree establishing the coup regime in the first place. I love how she tries to claim that it's merely an attendance list or something of the sort, but clearly was part of the entire opposition narrative, speaking of militarization, that used the armed forces to oust the democratically elected president, Hugo Chavez, briefly detaining him on an island for 2 days until he was rescued precisely by the civic military union that you're talking about.
Absolutely. So she signed the Carmona Decree. That is what it's called. And the Carmona Decree basically it erased the Venezuelan constitution, a constitution that it erased it in favor of the previous constitution, the one that was before Chavez, in which indigenous communities didn't have any identity, any rights. So that's the constitution that they favored, the ones where indigenous communities were completely erased. And they also dissolve all public and democratic institutions. I mean, that's the type of thing that Maria Corina has always favored.
And with the stroke of a pen, which is the part that really kind of blows my mind, for all of their claims to defense of democracy, we're talking about somebody who found it easy to sign on to a process that quite literally changed the name of the country back to its old colonial name before it became the Bolivarian Revolution, destroyed the constitution that was product of a wide-ranging, deep discussion with the population that was approved in a referendum that dissolved all elected bodies, not just the presidency, all of the 5 branches of government. I mean, it's quite, that alone is enough to tell you who Maria Corina Machado is and what she actually represents. But there's actually, of course, so much
There's a lot more. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot more. I mean, that takes me to the third criteria that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee said, and that is that her support for a peaceful transition to democracy. So let's break it down. As we said, in 2002, she helped consolidate the coup that briefly ousted President Hugo Chavez, and she signed the decree that dissolved all public and democratic institutions. In 2005, she traveled to Washington to meet with President George Bush and to ask him to overthrow the Chavez government through a military intervention. In 2014 and 2017, she supported violent street protests that killed a lot of people. I mean, people usually don't remember that these protests actually ended up in killing a lot of innocent people. One of them is actually a young man who was called Orlando Figuera, and he was burned alive in 2017. Because of these violent protests that Maria Corina Machado supported, financed, and promoted in Venezuela, all with the aim of achieving power by force.
And not just once, but twice. In 2014
yes.
and in 2017, she was very much active in that. That was her strategy. It wasn't win elections. It wasn't win support from the population. It was promote an insurrection and try to undemocratically oust the government.
Exactly. And then in that same year, in 2014, Machado went to Panama and she addressed the Organization of American States and asked them for a multinational force to overthrow the Maduro government. And she did this while she was a deputy, as a National Assembly deputy in Venezuela. So this was an act of treason against her country. Very fairly and very justly, she was stripped down of her position as a national deputy, and she was banned from holding public office because you cannot have someone who is going to address an international organization and say, oh, can you come please and intervene militarily in my country and put me in power, please? That's an act of treason that is unforgivable. So that is a ban that is being upheld even today. She cannot hold any public office.
I think it's funny how they try to use that as part of the arguments to say, oh, this is an authoritarian regime and they're limiting her ability to do X or Y. I think, no. There are consequences to your treasonous acts. Here, como decimos en español, right? Aquí en China, here and in China and all over the world, if you commit treason, there are consequences. And she's actually gotten off quite lightly in that regard. This is not about authoritarian. This is not about a crackdown against the opposition. It's about an undemocratic actor having to face the consequences of her undemocratic actions.
Indeed. And then even Worse than that is that since 2015 or even before that, she has been promoted U.S. economic sanctions against Venezuela. And as everyone knows, as you and I know very well, because we have been writing about this on VA for a long time, U.S. sanctions have had a devastating effect on the Venezuelan people, especially working class people, especially women who are working class. And she was one of the main promoters of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela. These are the same U.S. sanctions that created social economic catastrophe in Venezuela, that millions of people were forced to leave the country. They were forced to migrate. A lot of them went to the United States. And she tries to use Venezuelan migration in her favor, which is something that I found really, it's like an insult. Like, you created the conditions for people to be forced to leave their country, and now you're trying to use Venezuelan migration in your favor? No, you are the culprit of this situation. Even worse than that is the fact that there have been in these years, since Trump arrived to power for a second time, a criminalization against Venezuelan migrants in the U.S. And we have seen that Venezuelan migrants are being branded as criminals, like they all belong to a gang. They are all gang members. 252 men were sent to El Salvador under false accusations that they were members of a gang, and this has been disproven. And Maria Corina Machado has completely supported the criminalization of Venezuelan migrants in the U.S. She never said a word about the 252 men that were wrongfully sent to El Salvador and tortured, and who were only rescued because of the efforts of the Maduro government.
So, and it's interesting, right? You would think that with this platform, Nobel Peace Prize winner, she dedicated her win to Trump. She could have used this platform to stick up for her fellow countrymen and women, all of the people who are right now very much the targets of some of the worst, most violent, most racist repression that we've seen in modern times in the United States. The Venezuelan people are clearly one of the major targets of the Trump administration and of Stephen Miller and all of the other racists in his administration. Even to stand up for DPS, which is something that even Trump's coalition has kind of had a difficulty navigating. That could have been tremendous pressure to actually help Venezuelan citizens who are living in the United States, who are seeking to support their families and all the rest of it. But nothing. No. Instead, what did she use it for? To promote regime change.
Yes. And I mean, the list can go on and on and on. I think I have to mention last year, after the presidential elections, she also tried to once again ignite violence in Venezuela. Thankfully, this was quickly overthrown by the Maduro government and by the Venezuelan people themselves. Nonetheless, there were victims. I mean, 2 Venezuelan women, 2 Chavista women were killed during last year's brief violent protest after the election. And this is also something that she promoted. And finally, I mean, the current situation, we now have the U.S. military off the coast of Venezuela. They are threatening Venezuela. They are killing people in the Caribbean. Anyone who dares to go fishing or to migrate or to do whatever in Caribbean waters, the U.S. is killing them without proving that they were actually committing any illicit activities. And she is supporting these U.S. military buildup in the Caribbean. She is supporting the plans that the Trump government has of eventually attacking Venezuela territory, of eventually maybe intervening in Venezuela. She is collaborating completely with the psychological operation that is going on. You know, we are constantly being bombarded with news that there's an imminent invasion, that you cannot dare to go fishing. I mean, that our fishing communities in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Trinidad and Tobago, all the fishing communities are scared to go out and fish because they know they can be targets of a U.S. strike, and they cannot afford to. I mean, they cannot afford to not go fishing because it is the way they sustain themselves, but they also don't want to die. And Maria Corina is supporting this completely. I mean, it is something that it is completely irreconcilable to say that someone who is promoting military invasion against our country can be said that is promoting a peaceful transition to democracy. And furthermore, I mean, this is something that people need to know. If you look at Maria Corina's plan for Venezuela, she has this published on the internet. You can find it. You can find the Maria Corina government plan, and it is posted on the internet. And she has been speaking about it a lot since she won the Nobel Peace Prize. And her whole plan for Venezuela is basically, I'm going to privatize Venezuela's entire oil industry. I'm going to privatize Venezuela's industrial complex. I'm going to privatize public services, telecommunication services, electrical services. I'm going to privatize it all, and I'm going to open the doors for American and European companies to come and benefit from this privatization. She's basically surrendering Venezuelan sovereignty on a silver platter. And I think it's completely disgraceful that someone like that can ever be. The name Maria Corina Machado should never appear alongside the word peace.
Yeah, and of course, this plan would involve, yet again, another undemocratic action because everything she proposes is in violation of the Constitution.
Yes.
And so, what is she going to do? Ignore it and carry through her neoliberal shock therapy in order to fulfill the wishes of Washington and Brussels and the rest of the imperialist capitals of the world? Those are the consequences of it. So, there isn't even the slightest shade of democratic credentials to this. Before we move on to a different topic here, I wanted to get your opinion as a Venezuelan woman, as a Venezuelan feminist, around some of the criticisms that we've seen around the fact that some people have pointed out exactly who she is and what she represents, and they haven't been celebrating her win despite being only the second Latin American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. I was hoping you could answer some of these kind of white feminist arguments that we've heard in support of Maria Corina Machado.
Well, definitely that's what it is. I mean, Maria Corina Machado represents this liberal white feminist that doesn't displease the status quo. It is a kind of feminism that maintains the same imperialist, colonialist structure that oppresses the majority of women in the world, especially working class and Black indigenous women. So the idea that we need to celebrate any woman for any achievement, even if it means that she is just playing by the rules of the same oppressive structure that is against the majority of other women, is ridiculous. I mean, of course not. And I think most women in Venezuela understand very well that Maria Corina Machado does not represent the intersectional struggle of feminism. She represents the elites. She represents Western interests. And if anything, she's just someone who is actually eroding and making it even more difficult for women like me and for women across the global south to actually be heard and to actually put down the barriers that are being imposed against us.
Yeah, and this strategy is nothing new when it comes to these regime change efforts. I know I worked on a piece with a Canadian author around the so-called feminist foreign policy of then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who was funding these elite, white, rich feminists, so-called feminist people and organizations inside Venezuela, which were looking to do what? To reverse all of the gains of the Bolivarian Revolution, to destroy every little bit that they've actually been able to conquer through political struggle in order to deliver all of that on a silver platter to the elites that used to run the country and to US imperialism, which is so interested in the resources. I think it's always important to talk about that. Venezuela's obviously suffered greatly under the unilateral course of measures campaign, but it remains a country that is incredibly wealthy. Right now, there is a lot of poverty and a lot of suffering by the Venezuelan population as a result of the sanctions campaign, but it is a wealthy country with so many resources, and again, the largest proven reserves of oil on the planet. Even Maria Corina Machado has said, you don't even have to think about Saudi Arabia because we have more oil here, right? Just selling out the country.
Yeah,
That's been such a good breakdown for us. I really appreciate it. I think really if people want to understand who Maria Corina Machado is, they should just watch this segment here. I think you've done a really incredible job of telling us who she really is. And of course, right now, the timing of it is something really, really suspect. There's a lot more happening when it comes to the current plans of US imperialism, of the Trump administration, when it comes to Venezuela. I wanted to share this article here from our website around the CIA being authorized to conduct covert lethal actions inside of Venezuela. So I want to hand this over to you in just a minute, but to give people the context here, presidential finding is called, that's the jargon that they use, is rarely public. It's rarely made public. After the fact, often we find out that the CIA was involved, or they come and confirm what we already suspected. The two biggest examples being Arbenz in 54 in Guatemala and Allende in Chile in 73, where clearly the CIA was definitely involved. And that came out after the fact. But the fact that this came out now, I think, is very suspect. This sort of thing doesn't leak. This information actually came out on the very same day that the Pentagon had to kick out a bunch of reporters who refused to sign on to their new protocol, which basically made it impossible for them to even solicit information, these so-called leaks. So this was, for me, in my evaluation, clearly a deliberate leak. And I think that's part of the strategy. I think what Trump wants to do here is to increase the pressure to such a degree that Maduro feels like he has no option but to resign or leave the country or hand over power to a transitional government. And so this idea that the CIA is now authorized to conduct lethal covert action is yet another pressure tactic. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think they're capable of it. We've warned before on this program that a decapitation strike, some kind of action, some kind of assassination against key figures of the Bolivarian Revolution, I've talked about obviously the head of the National Assembly, but the defense minister, Vladimir Padrino, but up to and including President Nicolás Maduro himself. I think they're absolutely capable of doing that. Why do I think that that's kind of the route they're going with? Well, they've said so themselves, right? You know, some of these leaked information in other articles have revealed that the Trump administration is apparently frustrated that Nicolás Maduro refuses to leave office and has been pushing back against this White House narrative that they are involved in narco trafficking, and it finds it frustrating, and he wants to up the pressure that he leaves on his own. Why? Well, because you won't have the heat of the international community on you for assassinating a president or forcing his ouster or engaging in what it would be clearly a violation of international law, up and above what we're already seeing now in the Caribbean with a strike inside of Venezuelan territory. And that's not even to take into consideration the possibility of an invasion, right? That would cost U.S. lives, the lives of U.S. citizens and troops. And so that's, again, another risk. And I think it's important to always highlight the fact that there is a part of the MAGA, the Make America Great Again coalition, which is isolationist, which is opposed to foreign interventions and military adventures by the United States. And so I think all of this is about putting pressure on Maduro. But nonetheless, it's incredibly serious. Now we have the proof, and I think this is what should eliminate whatever doubt is in people's minds about the intentions of the United States in this moment. They want a coup. They want to oust Nicolás Maduro.
So I think your analysis is correct. I think what is happening now is that they are trying to put as much pressure as possible on the Maduro government. I imagine that they're either looking for Maduro to resign on his own, or for maybe some military forces to rebel against Maduro. I mean, they're hoping for something to happen inside Venezuela that takes care of the job of getting rid of Maduro without actually having to invade or intervene in Venezuela. I think this is all a psychological operation. I think that's why the most important thing that we can do now as Venezuelans is to keep morale high, is to stay united, is to recognize the psychological warfare against us. That's the best thing that we can do right now. So we don't fall under this absurd imperialist pressure. On the other hand, I also think that it is ridiculous, of course, that they announced that the CIA is planning some covert mission in Venezuela. The CIA works without having to ask for permission of the U.S. government. And they have been in Latin America, destabilizing Latin American countries and governments for years now, including Venezuela. I mean, last year there was this massive arrest of people who were likely involved in a violent coup against President Maduro. And there are a lot of indications that the CIA was behind it. I mean, the 2018 assassination attempt against Maduro, all of these things don't happen on their own. They are carried out by local terrorist groups, Well, the CIA, the US is always behind it somehow, whether financially, whether politically, they're always supporting these coup attempts. So the CIA has always been planning destabilization attempts against Venezuela. Something that I think is important to let people know, because I feel like nobody really speaks about it, is I recently wrote an article about all of these narco state allegations against Venezuela. And in this article, I talk about the CIA being involved in actual cocaine smuggling operations from Venezuelan territory to the United States. Thousands of tons of cocaine were smuggled during the 1980s and early 90s to the US with the approval of the CIA agents that were working here in Venezuela. And they did it in collaboration with a Venezuelan general, Ramon Guillén Davila. That was his name. And so the CIA was so involved inside the Venezuelan army, the Venezuelan military forces, that they actually worked together to smuggle cocaine to the United States. And this is actually where the so-called Cartel de los Soles is originated. Because this Venezuelan general, Ramon Davila Guillén, who didn't face any repercussions for what he did, he was a general, of course, so the whole idea that the sun insignia became the reference for the smuggling operation, and this is like the mythological origin of the Cartel de los Soles. But that was when the CIA, when Chávez came to power, one of the first things that he did was kick the CIA out of Venezuela, kick the DEA out of Venezuela. We saw a tremendous change. Venezuela stopped being a drug transiting country. Venezuela actually became even more effective in intersecting and So it is completely insane to me that people forget that the only moment in time when Venezuela was an actual drug trafficking spot to the United States is when the CIA was working here, and they didn't themselves. It is funny because if you read about it in the CIA files, they say that they investigated their own crimes and they decided that they didn't do anything wrong, that it was just like maybe poor decision making. That was all. That this is the same thing as Israel investigating its own war crimes. They look into their own organization and they decided nothing wrong happened. So I think it's important that people understand that the CIA, before Hugo Chavez, the CIA was very involved in Venezuela, and they actually were very involved in coup d'etats across Latin America, and they were involved in different assassinations and coup attempts against Hugo Chavez. In fact, in 2007, Hugo Chavez denounced that General Guillén, the same guy who was the CIA asset during the cocaine smuggling operation, he denounced that he was involved in an assassination attempt against him. So the CIA has been involved in different kinds of covert missions, lethal covert missions in Venezuela for a long time. It's nothing new. So they announcing this doesn't really mean anything because they never really left. They never really stopped trying to destabilize Venezuela. But I do think that at the bottom of this whole issue is that they're just trying to create this psychological warfare and try to create the conditions for an inside coup, which I think is very unlikely to happen, and which I think maybe opens more the doors to the idea that a military intervention could still be on the works, because they don't see the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan society, the Venezuelan military actually bending over and just accepting the pressure of the US empire.
I wanted to talk about what can happen from here. So we understand the situation. Clearly, this is an escalation. It's looking quite possible that the next step by the United States is going to be an attack inside Venezuelan territory. There's been some provocations with the Air Force of the United States flying inside of Venezuelan airspace, a couple of helicopters, a bomber, the bomber even kind of trolling with its flight pattern, really quite absurd, obtuse. There's this phrase going around that the country of the United States is being run by a bunch of 12-year-olds, and I think there's a lot of credence to that notion. But things are difficult. And I say that because on the one hand, we see this. I want to share this article about the fact that, yes, Washington has now pretty much cut off all diplomatic contact with Caracas. Why is that important? Because actually, people don't realize that. Yes, they've broken relations since the United States tried to impose Juan Guaido and recognize him as president. They don't have diplomatic representation in Venezuela. Venezuela doesn't have diplomatic representation in the United States. But there's always been channels of communication. There has always been at least some kind of back channel, unofficial. We learned recently that Qatar had played a mediator role and it was seeking to play a mediator role here. But they look very much dead set on this strategy, which is to use force, to use psychological warfare operations to try to pressure Maduro to leave, and quite possibly an actual military intervention, be it a decapitation strike or even, in the worst case scenario, an invasion. So I bring this up because while there are other mechanisms, but they too have been failing. So there's no room for negotiation. There's no channels open for this. Maduro has insisted on dialogue, but we're not seeing it. I want to bring up this article here about Venezuela turning to the United Nations. The United Nations exists precisely to prevent conflicts from breaking out. I don't think that there's anybody who has been following this news who thinks that the US is not clearly up to something. It's very obvious for anyone to see that this is clearly dangerous. That, and of course, in addition to the very flagrant abuses of international law, these extrajudicial killings of people, the fact that people can't even go out to sea to go and fish because of the fear that a bomb is going to rain down on them from the sky and end their lives in that very moment. Judge, jury, and executioner. Whoever is, in some cases, operating the drones from some base somewhere or some ship off the coast of Venezuela. If it's so clear, and I think any honest person would agree that it is clearly provocations, violent provocations, well then, shouldn't the body designed to preserve peace on this world step up? And thus far, they have been embarrassingly slow to react. I mean, there should have been far more stronger condemnation. China and Russia, Venezuelan allies, have clearly taken the correct position on this. But, I found it really, really quite troubling. And I would make the case that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, should resign because he was praising Maria Corina Machado in this moment where she's clearly part of a much broader plot to engage in regime change, to unconstitutionally break order in Venezuela. And one final thing, and I want you to reflect on this for our audience here, is of course that even within the United States, there was this resolution promoted by two Democratic senators, basically looking to enforce the own Constitution of the United States, which makes it so only Congress actually has the faculty to engage in war, as the United States is clearly doing in the Caribbean right now, and it failed. Right? There was no actual decision to pull back on this, to actually enforce the US Constitution and have Congress do its role, which is actually, providing a supervisory position when it comes to this. There's a lot of details in terms of what are the actual legal requirements, but suffice it to say, they're not following through on this. The Republican majority, although there was a handful of Republicans who did vote for it, clearly want to give Trump free rein to do this. And then finally, the most troubling bit of all out of this for me was the fact that one of the co-sponsors, Tim Kaine, but others like Alyssa Slotkin, a CIA operative, by her own admission, said, we don't have a problem with what you're doing. We actually were okay with it, but you need to ask us permission. So they're not against extrajudicial killings. They're against not being asked permission. What a terrible indictment of the US political situation, but also, as I said previously, the situation at a world scale, which is not rising to the occasion.
So, first of all, this is the same United Nations that did absolutely nothing during 2 years of genocide in Gaza. So we cannot really expect that the United Nations will be able to have the moral, background to say, we need to stop a possible intervention in Venezuela, which will kill probably millions of people, which will devastate the entire Latin American and Caribbean region. They don't have that moral clarity, unfortunately. They didn't have it when people in Gaza were being genocide for 2 years. They didn't have it when the people in Gaza were they were going hungry because of Israel blockade of the Gaza Strip. So in Venezuela has been denouncing this for a long time. Venezuela has been saying for a long time that the United Nations is no longer a place where the peoples of the world can go seeking for justice. They can, for peace or for peaceful resolutions. The United Nations has become like this anti-eco chamber in which only U.S. interests and European interests are promoted, are upheld, and basically all the United Nations is good for right now is for us to listen to religious speeches once a year, every year, you know? So unfortunately, I think what we saw in the United Nations Security Council meeting is just a representation of how empty and how inefficient this international body has become. It's also something we need to notice that most of the people that spoke in the Security Council, they began by saying, we congratulate Maria Corina Machado for winning the Peace Prize. And that says everything that you need to know about these people in this country and this organization. So they don't really care about what the U.S. is doing in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think the United States, when the U.S. representative said that they were going to continue doing what they're doing, no matter what anybody else says, it reminded me when Marco Rubio recently said that he doesn't care what the United Nations says about drug trafficking, because you know that the United Nations has a report that completely goes against what the U.S. says about Venezuela and drug trafficking. Yeah, I don't think we cannot count on the UN to do anything for Venezuela, for Gaza, or for anybody. I think hopefully one day we will dismantle the United Nations and just create a whole new organization will take its place in which people's voices will actually be heard. About this psychological warfare and about the UN, the United States Senate vote against the resolution to stop the military strikes against boats. What can I say? First of all, I think you're completely right that the Democrats don't actually care about the fact that innocent people are being killed in the Caribbean. They just care about the fact that they are not being asked, they are not approving these attacks. They are not being asked if the government can or cannot kill these people. We need to remember that what is happening in Venezuela right now began because of a Democrat president, Barack Obama. He was the one who imposed this ridiculous decree declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. And everything that has happened since then, all the U.S. sanctions that have been imposed, all these military threats, all the military building in the Caribbean, it all goes back to that Obama decree. So the Democrats and the Republicans have always been on the same page when it comes to foreign policy, which is interventionist, which is imperialist. I don't think we can actually expect anything, the Democrats to do anything to stop what is happening. I think it's also quite, something that is interesting is that the U.S. used to always talk about Venezuela in terms of dictatorship. There's a dictatorship in Venezuela. And now they talk about Venezuela in terms of narco-terrorism. And why are they doing this? They are doing this because, of course, when you don't deal with a dictatorship, with an alleged dictatorship the same way you deal with terrorism. Terrorism means that the door is open for military strikes, military intervention, for bombing. It means that you can approach the issue through law enforcement, through the military. So this change of narrative, the way the U.S. is now doubling down on the fact that Venezuela is a narco-terrorist state, it is precisely because they want to create, they're manufacturing the consent that, the only way to deal with this is to bomb the hell out of these people. That is what is happening, in my opinion.
So I think given this reality, there's a couple of things that are worth remembering. One, the Venezuelan people are prepared to defend their revolution, their country, their sovereignty. We've seen it. We talked about it in other episodes, the mobilization, the militia, the armed forces themselves, the civic military union. So don't count them out at all. I think this is something that needs to be central to this. Whatever strategy that people are trying to implement here, be it decapitation strike, be it an invasion, they have to understand that there is a Venezuelan people prepared to defend their country, their constitution, their president, and this will end terribly. Obviously we're opposed to this because we're anti-imperialists, but we're also humanists, and I am concerned about the humanitarian impact of this. I am worried that they really will go as far as to possibly invade the country. Do they think that people are going to take this lying down? I've seen comments from some of these most odious figures on social media saying that it's going to be people celebrating in the streets and they're going to welcome US bombs. Do US bombs distinguish between Chavistas and opposition? Of course not. They're going to kill Venezuelans just the same. There will be no liberation brought by US bombs. And of course, this other factor. This is a multi-decade long revolution. The revolutionaries will not sit back, even if there is a disaster scenario, even if Maduro is taking out. Do you think they're just going to tolerate Maria Corina Machado, la fascista, in office in Miraflores? You're talking about setting the conditions for a very violent civil war, most likely. It's Venezuelans killing each other. Is this the legacy that these policymakers actually want to have? I know that they don't seem to have any consideration in terms of their actual impact that their policies have, but people will remember them for being responsible for this and will hold them, hopefully, accountable. And on that note, given the failure of the United States institutions, its Senate, its Congress, the president, all of this that's supposed to constrain them, given the failure of the United States, I think more than ever, the response has to come from the region. There has to be an overwhelming consensus here in the Western Hemisphere, here in Nuestra America, that this is unacceptable and that we will not tolerate it. And if they go that far, then we're talking about maximum pressure strategy on the United States, which is to say break relations, freeze all commercial relations, make emphatic declarations in all the spaces possible, kick them out of all of the international institutions, actually put them into practice. Maybe they should be held account at the Organization of American States for once. Whatever it is, the response has to be clear. And I think, unfortunately, our institutions have failed. I don't have any faith in the OAS. I don't think they're going to do anything. I think it's absolutely correct that both Claudia Sheinbaum and Gustavo Petro have now said that they're not going to go to the Summit of the Americas. Good on them. That is a very good first start. I saw that finally today, Lula took a position, saying that Venezuela needs to decide what happens only by Venezuelans. Good, but it needs to be more forceful. It needs to be, and I think that makes us have to reflect on the lack of capacity that we've had to respond to this. It makes me think about UNASUR. UNASUR was destroyed precisely so that it couldn't intervene in moments just like this, because it did successfully intervene in previous moments. I think about Bolivia and the crisis that happened there, where UNASUR played a very active role in stopping that from becoming a bigger issue. So what do we have left? Well, we have CELAC, but CELAC as well. I think that I've made this criticism in other spaces, that basically this whole consensus model needs to be abandoned. Because when you have the Bukeles and the Noboas and the Mileys in the region, they're going to block anything that is aimed at preserving the dignity of our lands. And so that means maybe we should have a permanent secretariat. Maybe this rotating presidency system doesn't make sense. And obviously, that kind of big scale change has to come from the leadership here. There are progressive leaders in the region. They have taken good positions, but really this is the moment to truly stand up for the principle of sovereignty and what it means to actually defend it in the face of a clear campaign by the United States to once again engage in violent regime change.
But I just want to say that you are completely correct that the Venezuelan people are indeed organized and they know exactly what is at stake right now. They know that what is at stake is our sovereignty, is our right to live in peace. It is our right to choose the political project that we want for our country. And so, yeah, I think if they're expecting that we're just going to take it and that's it, no, that's not going to happen. And I also would like to believe, like you do, that Latin America didn't just rehearse like 2 decades of South-South integration and cooperation and solidarity just to give it all away in the face of the biggest threat to our region to date. So I also trust that at this point the region is going to prove that we have understood that we cannot be the backyard of the United States, that we need to stay united, that we need to defend our territorial integrity, that we need to defend our sovereignty no matter our ideological differences. Of course, I'm not counting on Milei or Bukele or these fascist governments. Of course, they don't count in this scenario, but I do trust that the majority of the Latin American governments, not just governments, but the social movements, all of these movements that have shown so much solidarity between us, I trust that we are going to be able to face this moment with the moral integrity that it needs and with the courage that it needs. Yeah, I also trust that somehow we are going to be able to make sure that the United States understand that the Monroe Doctrine, the interventionists, Latin America doesn't want that anymore, and we are going to fight back with everything that we have.
In a call to those inside of the United States, you also have to fight. You have to fight. We'll do our part here. I'm based out of Mexico. You're based out of Venezuela. We will organize. We will meet, march on the streets. We will denounce. We will publish. We will host podcasts, whatever it takes. But there has to be more, and a message in particular to those so-called left critics of Maduro that we've seen kind of bubbling up once again, these social chauvinists who think they have something to teach us, who think that they have the authority to besmirch a long process that is the Bolivarian Revolution, to say, well, that's authoritarian and he deserves to go and I don't care what happens. There's no room for that anymore. Get your shit together. Resist imperialism. Find what you can do to actually stop this murderous campaign from moving forward. We did our best when it was trying to stop a genocide, but we didn't succeed. And I think that is a shame on all of us, and myself included. I wish I could have done more. Well, we can stop another murderous campaign now, but not if people are entertaining these notions that they somehow have the authority to judge other processes and therefore they're not deserving of solidarity. Of course they are. And a message to you as well. We're paying attention. Gone are these days of social democracy where you can just benefit from the value transfer from the global south to the global north to buy off the working class. Attitudes from even important figures that have really grown in prominence. I found it so incredibly disheartening to see Mamdani, this candidate in New York City, who's been so good on the issue of Palestine, call Cuba and Venezuela dictatorships. You clearly don't get it then. You don't get it. It's not about what you think is or isn't a democracy. It's about resisting imperialism and the role of imperialism in maintaining this world system. So I make a very deliberate call to those of you who made it this far and are watching here, get organized, engage in more actions, build these coalitions, find the spaces where people are doing it. There's a handful of people who were here in town very recently for a Cuba Solidarity Conference, and I made the same call to them. They are ready and willing and happy to receive that new energy from people, but it takes work. And really, this is the moment to really put your feet to the fire and get started on resisting imperialism inside the belly of the beast.
Indeed. So if I can just add one comment to what you just said, even though we didn't stop the genocide in Gaza, we did revert the narrative then that Israel was just defending itself and that the Palestinian people were somehow all guilty and all terrorists. We did revert that narrative, and that was because of the movement, that was because of the solidarity movement that we saw across the world in every city and every country, even in the United States and even in Europe. And so I think we cannot, we need to understand that we do have power. As people, we do have power to at least revert the false narrative that imperialist powers always use to criminalize global South people. So I do think that moving and organizing and building solidarity with Venezuela and with Palestine is still going to have a huge impact in fighting back against these wars, these genocides, and these attempts at military intervention.
Andreína, as always, I'm so grateful for all of your analysis and your commentary. I think, again, in particular, watch the first part of this podcast here to get a real, true understanding of who Maria Corina Machado really is. It's time to break those myths, change the narrative, and of course also shift the narrative when it comes to Venezuela, a people that simply want to be free, just like everybody else. Thanks so much for joining us. This has been yet another episode of the Venezuela Analysis Podcast, giving you news and analysis about the Bolivarian process from a grassroots perspective, a leftist perspective. And of course, we'll be here to continue to inform about what's going on. And should there be a nightmare scenario, you can count on us to come online and do a live and be connected with you as much as possible, because that's our way of contributing to the resistance here against U.S. imperialism. Thanks again, Andreína.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.